Hey everybody, back again. Last time we were talking about the threat stress response and the COVID-19 virus and associated crisis. Just to put a framework around what we're going to talk about today, I'll do a quick review of the last session in the locker room. But what I want to get to at the end of this session today is to talk about some of the things that we can do to quiet the threat stress response and not only feel better in general, but boost our immunity, boost our ability to fight a virus, as well as prevent other things, other deteriorations in our bodies, chronic illnesses and disease, and recognizing even our immune system is highly engaged in mopping up cancer cells and the prevention of cancer. So, got the whiteboard behind me, and if you remember last time we were talking about the threat stress response. We started by focusing on what is a threat to us, and we discussed that painful sensations signal threat to us. Painful emotions can signal threat to us. Lions, tigers, and bears can be threatening to us and harm us physically. Monsters, and as Eric Church says, all the monsters aren't necessarily underneath the bed, can signal threat stress to us. Other people can be a source of signaling threat stress, or in fact just be a real threat to us. Our own thoughts also play a part in this. We talked a little bit about our negative thoughts will tend to stimulate our threat stress response. We also talked about generational traumas and our own individual traumas and traumatic memories, and particularly talked about the predictive codes running in our subconscious, running in the shadows of our mind, deeper down in our brain, and how they can stimulate the threat stress response. Noting that these predictive codes may be primarily designed to be assessing our environment constantly for whether or not we're safe or whether or not we're in danger. And that the subconscious mind has millions more times the activity than the conscious mind, and these predictive codes are going on constantly without our awareness. So not only can they consume a fair amount of energy, they also, just based on their volume, can have a significant effect in stimulating our threat stress response. And then we moved on to the discussion of what we do with aversive, uncomfortable, painful thoughts or emotions, and how we suppress them or compartmentalize them or repress them and stuff them into the shadows, into the subconscious. But that energy doesn't just dissipate there, it tends to live there. And that energy will also poke at things to stimulate the threat stress response, and can have a significant role in our overall health, and that includes our physical health and our mental health. We touched on some things such as adverse childhood events, which are really a great sort of microscope to look at this phenomenon through in how kids who had significant adverse childhood events are at risk for more illness and disease, have lower immunity, and we're also talking not just physical illness and disease, but mental health illness and disease, and they're at a higher risk for those. So we moved on from there to talk about the anatomy. What is the center of our threat response? And that is our amygdala. We have two of them in the temporal lobes, And when we sense threat or stress, this alarm system jacks up and causes a cascade of events, not only through the brain but through our entire physiology, sending a signal from the hypothalamus to the pituitary to the adrenal glands through our blood system to activate us to fight the threat stress and to help us to find safety and survive. And then we talked about how it activates through the nervous system, similar phenomenon with certain transmitters that get elevated under threat and stress. And ultimately we came about to talking about through the blood flow system and the hormonal system and elevation and adrenaline, which jacks up our heart rate, jacks up our respiratory rate, increases the force of contractions of the heart and jacks up our blood pressure, gets us ready for fight and flight. And we talked about through this same blood system and the adrenal gland, the release of cortisol, which has effects on immune function, but primarily it's really designed to mobilize fuel to sustain a fight and flight. So that was the blood system, and then we went into some of the transmitters, particularly important in fight or flight: noradrenaline, glutamate, histamines, and most specifically and importantly, these pro-inflammatory cytokines that have a significant role in our physiology in fight or flight, but also in freeze and faint, and a significant physiology in fighting the COVID-19 virus. We also talked about in fight, that tends to be a high noradrenaline transmitter state, but also a high dopamine state. So we are upright and more aggressive until we either sense or imagine we're going to get our ass kicked, or until we're actually getting our ass kicked. And then our dopamine drops, and now our norepinephrine starts flying. It has no competition from dopamine for receptors, and we get more of it, and that's our flight response, where we experience fear and more anxiety, sometimes overflowing eventually into panic, but we're also more vigilant. We're not going to sleep. We talked about that state of fight and flight is characterized by mobilization, high energy consumption, reactivity, and inflammation. And then we moved on to talk about what happens when the fight or flight system is getting exhausted, or we are truly losing the battle, that we are not going to win the battle. And this is whether it's with another person, a lion, a tiger, a bear, a virus, or a bacteria. What happens is, as those cytokine levels go sky high, we end up activating this little part of the brain way down in the medulla, or way down in the brainstem, primitive part of the brain that has an override of the fight or flight response, and we activate through the dorsal motor nucleus the freeze and faint response. So again, the freeze and faint response seems maladaptive, but it's not. If you're going to lose the battle, or you're losing the battle, it may be a time to surrender and hope the pathogen passes, whether it's a bacteria or a virus or a person or a lion, tiger, or bear, and then restore and recover. So in freeze, we're very withdrawn. Our posture becomes much more stooped. It's a submissive posture. It's a suggestion of surrender. In a human being, it may evoke some sympathy or empathy. And if it goes on chronically, we tend to appear, somewhat depressed. And if it gets more severe, we will go into a faint response. And in that case, things really start shutting down. We feel a little detached from ourselves. We feel detached from our surroundings, we feel detached from other people, and eventually we go into a frank collapse and we're on the ground in the fetal position. We noted that this physiology has a loss of hormones, a significant drop in our hormones, a significant drop in our neurotransmitters, so serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine go very low, but the cytokines stay high as long as there's threat present. So this amygdala can still have high volume and be pushing out some things like cytokines, or stimulating the system to continue to produce cytokines if there's still threats present, even though we're overall shutting things down. So if this was characterized by high energy production, high energy consumption, the freeze or faint response is characterized by trying to conserve energy. We're running out of resources, we're losing the battle, let's conserve some resources and hopefully live to fight another day. So the freeze and faint responses are characterized by immobilization and yet still persistent inflammation. The scary thing that happens in freeze and faint, though, is in this energy conservation mode, our immunity falls. So this is probably mediated by multiple mechanisms, but in terms of a model, you can imagine if your dopamine, noradrenaline, or norepinephrine fall and your serotonin levels fall, we tend to become slumped over or fetal and depressed and withdrawn. These same receptors exist on our white blood cells that fight off infections, and they also become depressed, and therefore our immunity can fall under chronic severe stress or particularly threat stress response. We went on to discuss what happens to the cortical brain, the neocortex, under threat stress response, and the fact that this area, and a lot of this area actually goes offline. It's not working very well. This is mediated by the outflow from the amygdala. It's mediated by high noradrenaline initially, and also mediated by the cytokine mechanism. So when this part way up here, the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex goes offline, we talked about how our IQ falls, that we have decreased attention concentration, poor reasoning, poor planning, poor strategizing, poor working memory, decreased insight, decreased judgment, decreased rational thought, and we tend to see an increase in paranoia, prejudice, misperceptions, and even mispredictions, where the shadow part of the brain, the subconscious part of the brain, it becomes biased towards threat, and that makes sense. It's trying to keep us safe, but at times these mispredictions can cause problems. Then we talked about the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, or our EQ, and what happens when the amygdala gets jacked and shuts that down. We have trouble connecting with people, we don't bond well, we lose empathy, we have a decrease in our moral judgment, we have impaired remorse, we have poor ethics, we have difficulty with certain kinds of decision making, and this can be a problem for addicts and gamblers, that type of thing. We see an increase in selfishness, an increase in isolation, which can be harmful for us over the long run. We're such a pro-social species. People tend to have more depression, more dissociations, which we talked about in freeze and faint, and can become, frankly, psychotic. We also briefly mentioned our loss of the cortical language function, where we have a harder time expressing ourselves in full sentences and paragraphs and things like that. and yet we are able to preserve emotional language, at least initially in fight or flight, and that even tends to disappear in freeze or faint. So we can do a lot of swearing and yelling and grunting and groaning in fight or flight. It all tends to quiet down in freeze or faint when we're trying to conserve resources, withdraw, maybe hide even in order to survive. So we went on and talked a little bit about the toilet paper phenomenon when we push into this mode and our cortical functions shut down, and for our own individual survival we become selfish. We're more likely to hoard things. We also lose some reasoning and rational thought. So even if it doesn't make sense to us in kind of a normal state of mind, to have piles and piles of toilet paper stacking up in our garage in this state, trying to reason with somebody about that type of thing is literally like asking a blind man to see, because the part of his brain that's responsible for reasoning is relatively offline, if not, in some severe cases, completely offline. And then we quickly went back to this whole phenomenon of fight and flight and freeze and faint, and how it plays out in terms of an acute infection, a viral infection, a COVID-19 infection, and the idea that, number one, the virus is a threat, so it activates the threat-stress response. This tends to be much more kind of a fight-flight response initially, with high fevers, agitation, irritability, that type of thing, and our system is geared up to go on the attack of a virus. No different than if it was geared up to go to war and fight another type of a battle. Maybe not the fever, but a lot of the physiology is very similar. So as we go along fighting this thing, we can get to a point where we are being defeated and we're being exhausted, and we have the chance of going into the freeze-faint physiology that we talked about, and that gets complicated. We tend to go towards collapse. We're not mounting a fever. We're dropping our blood pressure. We're dropping our heart rate. We're dropping our respiratory rate. We're in a mode of trying to surrender, trying to conserve resources, and essentially withdraw, hide, rest, recover, hopefully. But we don't always recover well. Human beings need a fair amount of oxygen delivery, and if our blood pressure drops too low, our respiratory rate drops too low, our heart rate drops too low, delivering oxygen to our tissues becomes a problem, and we can pass. And as we noted, when we get into this, our immunity falls, our ability to fight bugs falls. But we also noted that the reason people are dying from COVID-19, it doesn't seem to be a viral overload necessarily. It seems to be a cytokine overload. So let's go back and just review that real quickly. Is all of these threat stress things we talked about earlier can add to our chronic and then our acute threat stress load, which keeps piling up. So if you had adverse childhood events, you've got a layer. If you've got obesity, diabetes, heart disease, lung disease, kidney disease, cancer, autoimmune disease, your threat stress load is already elevated. And if you start to get fearful, if you start to go down the emotional threat stress pathway, that can jack it up. If you get extremely fearful and go into panic, that can throw the threat stress system sky high and push you into freeze, faint, collapse physiology. So what corresponds well with that loading up of the threat stress system is the cytokine load. And so the cytokines are these pro-inflammatory and pro-immunologic chemicals that help to fight infection. But when they go too high, they start causing collapse, and all kinds of stuff happen. We get leaky membranes, we get edematous, and fluid starts filling up the wrong spaces, and we have more localized tissue destruction in those cases, and that can be devastating to us. So let's just talk about Plaquenil real quickly. Chloroquine, hydroxychloroquine. This is an immunologic medication that's been used for malaria, but it's been more used actually for autoimmune diseases, the things like arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, and lupus, and that type of thing, because they modify the immune system. When our own immune system is attacking our body, this can dampen that response. And in some sense, with viruses, they're kind of interesting because they come into our body and then they actually go into our cells and sort of use our own cells to replicate themselves. Their little genetic code, their little RNA strands, and then they pop back out and carry on. So if we were to actually give somebody Plaquenil in their fight or flight phase when they're trying to beat the crap out of the virus, then that might not be good. It might blunt the immune response to attacking the virus. However, if we see somebody who is starting to show trends like, oh boy, this system is getting exhausted, it's going to go into freeze and faint here, and a cytokine storm is not what we want. We don't want to go into collapse if we can prevent it. Then that might be a time where giving somebody Plaquenil could potentially blunt the immune response. And we know that Plaquenil, we don't know how it really works for sure, but a couple of things it may do is, as a virus tries to penetrate its cell, it may block the penetration. But as the virus or the RNA, the code, the protein, the nucleic acid code is trying to come out of the cell, it may block it being able to get back out. I don't know that it actually blocks the replication or not, but we do know that it probably dampens the cytokine load, and that might be primarily where it is allowing people, if it is, we'll see, to survive. And there is the possibility we're going to get mixed data, because if people are taking prophylactic Plaquenil and they're blunting their immune response, and it is really based on having an immune response and not at this cellular, sort of in and out of the cell level, then they actually could get sicker from using the Plaquenil. Anyway, that was a bit of a digression, but it is out there and it's worth talking about. So what we really want to do is have high immunity, be able to kill the virus and prevent a cytokine storm, because a cytokine storm is probably the thing that would end up killing us as much as the virus. So having a low baseline threat stress level is really important. Now, some of us aren't going to be able to get that low immediately. I mean, if we're already suffering from obesity, diabetes, heart disease, kidney disease, lung disease, etc., that's a little bit more of a challenge. We have to acknowledge that those people are at increased risk. And we talked previously that older people tend to have an increased risk, and we talked about how mental health diagnoses have been correlated with high chronic stress threat and high cytokines. So we can do a better job of identifying who's at risk for decompensating from a viral infection, and we can protect those people more than others. We can prioritize their protection. But I think that the big issue here is so much of our threat stress response is mediated by our emotional system, our social system, our spiritual system. This is something that we can get control of, and that's in particular what I'm advocating for in this process. Our scientists really like to look downstream at the interface of the virus at the cellular level, and what can we do to interject in there to kill the virus or block the response or something. But if we go way upstream and start figuring out how we chill out this amygdala, we can do some real good in managing this crisis. So that's kind of where I wanted to get today. And some of this stuff is pretty common sense. Some of it is not something that we necessarily think about, so I want to get into that. And the good news is some of this is actually fun. I mean, it's doing stuff that make us fully human, wholly human, which we don't do in our modern culture. We have different contagions that we've gotten these cultural and social constructs and memes of what it is to be a successful person, or an important person, or a nice person. Well, these are contagions as well. We harbor them in our brain, and they aren't always advantageous to us, but we pass them along from person to person to person, and it's another form of a pandemic in some sense. So let's dig in and actually talk about maybe what we could do to feel better. The basics. So good food. Now, if we are in fight or flight and we want to stay out of freeze and faint, one of the things that can throw us into freeze or faint is to run out of fuel, to start becoming exhausted, and our system will shift gears to try to save us. So, and we want to stay out of freeze and faint. That's pretty extreme stuff. And high quality food is important, even when you don't feel well, to keep some resources coming into the body to fight the battle, right? So we will crave sugary stuff, and sugar is not inappropriate to keep the battle going. If you just can't keep anything down, you can eat the simple carbohydrates. They're easy to digest. Simple carbohydrates are what we crave when we're in fight or flight. We don't crave protein and fat. The problem is if we're not fighting an infection, or we're not fighting the tiger, eating a lot of simple carbs from chronic emotional or social or spiritual pain, we're not burning enough calories, and we end up getting fat, and we contribute to this whole fiasco, right? But eat whole, unprocessed foods and get lots of color. Doesn't have to be much different than that. If you're really having a hard time with the fats and the proteins, make sure you're giving yourself frequent small doses of some simple carbs, easy to digest, to give the system some fuel to fight this thing. And stay hydrated. So another real simple thing to do is try to sleep 8 hours. Now, I say simple, in fight or flight, not that easy. We're activated. So, in kind of the acute phase of any attack, viral or lion, tiger, bear attack, it may be a little bit difficult to sleep. But if you can get at least 7 to 8 hours of rest, that's super helpful. If you have been slipping more into kind of a freeze type mode, you may need more sleep, and you need to take frequent naps. Your body's telling you to curl up and restore and recover, save some energy. So listen to your body, makes sense. I will add that if you are in fight or flight, you're having a little bit of difficulty getting to sleep, and you're looking at your screens, waiting for the next catastrophe to come at you, you may want to try a little melatonin. It may not only help you sleep, it may help your immune system a little bit. So sleep is super important. It's where we do our restorative work, our repair work. We're able to conserve some energy in that state, and it needs to be attended to. You can go on to a website and find a lot of things around sleep hygiene and what you should be doing in that arena. The other thing that I'll bring up is just get outside. Get outside and experience nature. Now, if you're living in a concrete jungle like New York and the parks are closed and it's hard to find nature, one of the things that we always have available to us is the sky. So get outside and look at the skyscape. We have very little pollution. The sky is absolutely gorgeous and phenomenal, and it doesn't matter whether it's storming or it's blue and sunny or the stars are out. And the other thing I think when you look at the sky is breathe deep. This is a nutrient out there for us that is readily available to all of us. You know, this sense of awe and to be able to pull in this great oxygenation, expand our lungs, and find a sense of peace by being in nature. We are suffering from a nature deficit disorder in the modern world, and our evolution was for millions of years. We've only lived in these concrete jungles for a very short time, and our body's not used to it and doesn't really like it that way. Now, let's go back to exercise. So exercise, as we talked about in the previous session, is a good stress. It makes us feel good, it makes us more resilient, it helps our immunity. And when if you're not infected, not sick, but sitting at home and you're stressed and you're restless, you're in fight or flight. It's a mobilization response. Somebody says, well, lie down on the floor and relax, meditate, you know. That's really hard to do because everything in your physiology is saying, I got to get out of here, you know. I've got to move. I need to mobilize. So it's important to respect that, and movement is super helpful if you are, particularly if you're in flight phase, if you feel like you need to flee, if you're getting a little twitchy and a little restless. So, you know, you can do any form of exercise and with fairly vigorous intensity in a flight phase. If you're down here and freeze and faint, you got to rethink that. Your body is saying, shut it down, you know, take it easy. I need to recover. So you may still want to get outside, take a short walk, get some fresh air, look at the skyscape, but be respectful of what your body's telling you. So getting out and moving is the natural thing to do, and it will make you feel better if you're in a flight state. Now, let's say you're in fight. Let's say you're pissed off, right? You know, and this is really important. Our tendency culturally, we're talking about this, is to deny that, is to say, boy, if I'm angry, I'm not a good person, right? I need to control myself. Well, I agree that being angry at somebody and fighting back at somebody who's perhaps attacking you emotionally, not physically, is usually not very helpful. Usually that type of anger that's coming, you know, what we won't call it psychologically, the emotional attack, it's a signal to you that maybe there's a boundary to be set, but you don't necessarily need to retaliate because then things tend to get worse. But I would say don't deny that feeling of fight. That emotion is in us for a reason, and we need to acknowledge it and integrate it successfully. Now, if it's actually a tiger, you probably need to, you know, punch him in the nose before you go into freeze and faint. So allow that to be integrated, and you know, it's okay to have a punching bag and to punch a pillow or to shadow box to get that energy out. You need to acknowledge that it exists in us. It is part of who we are. What you need to not do is let it become destructive. And so chronic anger becomes really problematic. I think Nelson Mandela said that holding anger is like drinking poison and hoping the other person dies. So acknowledge that holding on to anger is not useful, but it's there to bring us to attention. It's there to alert us we might be in some form of danger and to seek safety and survival. Now the strategies we use become important in how to deal with that. So I would encourage movement if you are in fight or flight, and that also can include things like yoga, tai chi, qigong. They're a little bit more structured, a little less free-flowing, but we know that they actually help calm this amygdala and boost our immunity. So you can explore all of those things, and there's a lot of ways to do that. So we've been talking about sort of this emotional energy and the repressions and suppressions and how we, where we put those, and how we repress them and don't acknowledge them, and the fact that anger is one of those, and we need to acknowledge that as being part of us. So another thing that we can do that I think is really helpful is what I call sensory and emotional awareness and integration. Once you've kind of gotten the wiggles out and everything, I think it's a really good time to find a quiet place to sit or lie down and start with some deep breathing. A 6 count in, hold for 2, and a 4 count out. So this will slow down our system. It will help to deactivate the amygdala, and it will help to boost the activity in the nucleus nucleus ambiguous that makes us feel better. It's kind of our feed, breathe, rest, digest, sex and relax physiology. So that'll bring us to even a deeper calm, and you can do that for as long as you need to. Just if you get distracted, keep coming back to your breath, keep coming back to your count, and make sure you breathe deeply. I think that deep breathing is super important for us, in managing ourselves in our health and in early illness. And I think it's still important in later illness, if you have COVID, to expand your lungs. It provides a pressure to squish out the fluid and gets oxygen down there to help kill off some of the bugs. So deep breathing is super important. But once you find yourself in a place of calm, then and however you feel comfortable, you may be on the floor, you may be in a comfortable chair, hands on your thighs, maybe your palms are up and in a sense of openness. But start a scan of your body and start with your toes and wiggle your toes, and how do they feel? They feel okay, or maybe they feel a little numb and tingly. Doesn't matter. And come up your legs and wiggle your ankles around, and then wiggle your knees. How do they feel? Up to my hips, how do they feel? Give them a little wiggle, and then come up to your low back and your spine and get a sense for how that feels. Roll it back and forth, side to side, work up your spine, come up to your neck and shoulders, maybe give them a little shimmy, like you're gonna shoot a free throw. Just kind of get them to relax a little bit and plug into where your neck and shoulders are. Now come up the back of the head and just sense any tension or headache or anything like that, and come forward into your jaw. Sense your muscles. Are they tense? Can you relax your jaw? Don't grit your teeth. And just do a scan up the body that way. Now, as you're going, you might run into something. You might run in and say, man, boy, that feels really good. Or you might find a pain. And this is where it gets really important that you go, hey, God gave me this pain system for a reason. It's part of me. It's good for me. It's there for my survival. And say, hi, pain, you are my friend. Don't catastrophize. Don't get more anxious. Recognize that that pain there is there for a reason, and it is your friend, and just experience it. Now, what we're going to do next is go back down to our pelvis and check in with our genitals and our bladder and see how they're feeling. Do I have to urinate? Or maybe I'm sensing a little tension in my internal sphincter of my bladder. And then move up and check in with your intestines. How are they feeling? Feeling pretty good, you know. Or maybe you've got a little bloating or a little cramping. You're feeling a little bit of something there. Hopefully not sharp pain. But again, it's there for a reason. So just acknowledge, thank you, my friend, for bringing my attention to this. Go up to your stomach. Maybe you're feeling hungry. Maybe you're feeling tight. Maybe you're feeling a little indigestion coming up into your esophagus. And come up into your lungs and your heart. Am I tightened in my chest? Am I having any chest pain? Do I feel tight and having difficulty with breathing? Take a big, deep breath. Just check in with that. Or maybe you're feeling warm and happy in your heart. Maybe there's some good connection going on. And come up on into your throat. We can carry a lot of tension in our vocal cords and in our throat. And just get a sense where that is. And then we're going to move on. So this is where it gets harder. It gets particularly hard for people like me. Number one, I'm a guy. And number two, I'm a doc. So I'm really well practiced in repression. So we're going to do an emotional inventory, just like we did a body or somatic inventory and a visceral inventory. And so now you're going to sit back and kind of fold back into your mind and say, what am I feeling? You know, am I feeling anxious? Am I feeling joyful? Am I feeling love? Am I feeling anger or resentment? Am I sad? And so check in with that. Now, I'll tell you, that's really hard for me. I have a hard time identifying emotions, okay? So I've been culturally scripted that way. I've been repressing and suppressing most of my life. You know, probably after I was 3, something like that. So, and there is a syndrome called alexithymia where people just, they tend not to really feel emotions. And then I describe myself as a recoverer, and I feel like I still have dyslexithymia, where I still struggle to really find the emotions, identify them properly. But as you're doing this kind of emotional scan, how do I feel? Go back down into your body and see if you're feeling sad. Oh, yeah, I got a little bit of that down here, you know? If you're feeling angry, yeah, I got a little bit of it here. It's up in here. Oh, it's up in my jaw. You know, I'm feeling anxious. I might feel it through here. You know, I feel just a little rapid in my heart rate. Struggling to take a deep breath. Take a deep breath and relax. So this is what I referred to as sensory motor. I'm sorry, sensory emotional awareness and integration. And it's super helpful if we can feel our emotions and identify our emotions, and then deal with them properly instead of ignoring them and compartmentalizing them and stuffing them, and keeping this chronic negative energy going on in the shadow of our brains. So just going through that process, you should come out more relaxed, and this guy should be dialing it down, stopping the adrenaline, the cortisol, the noradrenaline, the glutamate, the histamines, and those pro-inflammatory cytokines that can get really nasty in high doses, and all of a sudden this part of the brain is starting to take over. Now this is a more primitive part of the brain. It's been there longer. It makes sense that it ought to have some ability to trump this guy in not the newest part of the brain, but in a newer part of the brain. So we want to take advantage of getting this nucleus ambiguus online and helping us. And we'll mention again, when the dorsal motor nucleus is online, we tend to be high in inflammation and low in immunity, and that's a dicey state. When this nucleus ambiguus comes online, we start dropping those cytokines, but also our immunity starts coming back online, and that's super important. So we want to go through that process. Now, we've been talking a lot about these suppressions and repressions and kind of this stuffed negative energy that's circulating in the subconscious of the mind. So that's a tricky thing, right? We have a hard time accessing what's in our subconscious. By definition, it's not conscious to us. So what else can we do to decompress that energy? And this, I think, gets really interesting. And if you look at some work by Pennebaker and Hanscom on expressive writing, we know that soothes this system and boosts our immunity. And if you look at some work by Gordon and working with trauma victims, we know that expressive drawing and expressive movement also help to decompress this guy, to shut him down and to bring this nucleus online and dampen our threat stress response. So this is where it gets kind of fun, because the types of things that we should be doing to help drop our cytokine level, drop our threat stress response, and boost our immunity, and also make us feel good, are relatively fun. So there are certain things that have to happen with these expressive activities. They can't have a lot of structure. They need to sort of occur a little bit spontaneously. Now, you may have the intention to sit down and draw or write or watercolor or move, and that's okay. But once you get into the activity, it can't be too choreographed, and you can't be judgmental. And the other thing is that it has to be done basically for no good purpose. You don't have a great intention of coming out with a product. And in fact, at the end of it, there really shouldn't be a product. You need to learn to let go. And so with expressive movement, once you stop moving, the product's gone. But if you've created a watercolor or a drawing, or you've done some writing, you throw it away and you do it again the next time, right? So the idea is, through this and this process, you allow the things in the subconscious to just percolate through. They come out in your body, in your movement. They come out in whatever weird stuff you end up putting on paper, either through artwork or through writing. And I should mention, the writing, you don't have to use sentences, you don't have to punctuate. If every other word is a swear word, that's where you're at. And it's for you to offload these emotions. It's not for other people to read or judge. And it becomes very important that you don't do it in a state of being self-conscious, that you know that you can do it however you want to. Even singing is great. Now, for me, I can't sing a lick, so it would be very hard for me to sing in front of people. So if I'm going to sing, I'm not going to do it around a bunch of people, because I want to let this energy out. I want to breathe deep and sound terrible, maybe even put earplugs in so I can't hear myself. But however you do those expressive activities, they may be some of the most important things that you can do. And notice how much they mirror the activity of play. This was a mind blow for me when I was reading about the importance of play. And I sat back in my chair and went, I don't know how to play anymore. I remember that as a kid. What would I do today to play? So some of these expressive activities are essentially play. And so we need to do it with that kind of energy and get out of the analytical mode of everything and get out of our left brain and get into our right brain and get down into the shadows of our brain and let this stuff out and see what it looks like. Who knows what it'll look like? So I think that's really important. Now, when I say all this, I'm not minimizing some of the things that we traditionally prescribe to help us with stress and threat. Some of the more traditional things that you usually see when you go onto a website for managing your stress response include meditation. So meditation and mindfulness are very much a part of this. You can actually go back to our breathing and our sensory and emotional awareness and integration process and realize that looks very much like being mindful, fully mindful of the fact that I have a full spectrum of emotions, and fully mindful of the fact that I have a full spectrum of sensations, and fully mindful that some of these sensations, though they feel uncomfortable, are my friend. They're built into me for my survival. The other thing you frequently see is psychotherapy, which can be psychoanalysis or cognitive behavioral therapy or dialectic behavioral therapy, things like that. And I think those are really, really awesome. They can help organize us to understand who we are and why we're like that. And they can also help us with some of our misperceptions and our predictions. By reorganizing the way we look at the world, we can rewrite some of those predictive codes, and they're super helpful. But I will mention, if you're under fight or flight or freeze or faint physiology, doing cognitive behavioral type therapy is really difficult. And I think that's why it has a relatively low success rate, is that the timing of it, just like the timing of Plaquenil, the hydroxychloroquine, is important. When you introduce those types of therapies, it's much better if you've done this work to pull yourself out of freeze and faint up into fight or flight, and then into a state of calm, where some of these functions are online because they're super valuable when you're doing cognitive behavioral therapy. Similarly, giving somebody a book to read when they're in fight or flight or freeze or faint, this is not going to work. They can't sit still, or they can't think, they can't concentrate, they can't remember. They're either in a reactive mode and mobilization mode or an immobilization mode, but they're not in a mode of higher cortical function and contemplating their belly button like that. So the staging of this is really important. So the next thing I want to bring to mind, well, let's just reflect. If we can get our to a place of calm and get the nucleus ambiguous online, it will spontaneously bring all of this cortical function back online, and now we become that moral animal that we really admire. And again, I warn against saying when we're in this state we're an amoral animal. We are in a survival state, and it's perfectly reasonable if we have a high level of threat and stress that we would be this way, because we are fighting for our lives. Now, sometimes that's a physical life, but sometimes it's an emotional, social, and spiritual life that we're fighting for. So now let's go back one more time to the COVID-19 crisis. and how we might be able to approach this a little bit differently. I think what we have to do is, if we're at home and we're trying to look after ourselves and staying healthy, we need to engage all of these things that I've been talking about right now to keep us out of fight or flight and freeze and faint mode. That will keep our immunity high, and it will prevent a lot of other disease, including the physical decompensation that comes with other diseases, but maybe even more importantly, the mental, emotional, spiritual decompensation that can come that can lead to other types of disasters, grabbing the bottle, or fighting with a spouse, or not tending to your children's needs. Things like that are super important right now. But let's say you've got the COVID bug and you want to beat it. You need to know where you are on the spectrum for fight or flight, but you should absolutely engage in these things as a primary way of actually defeating and surviving the viral attack. And again, I mentioned in the last session my concern with what's happening to people as they get more short of breath and they get more fearful and more panicky, and how we engage them once they're into a healthcare institution, where a lot of this stuff goes completely offline. They are completely disconnected, completely isolated, and as a social species, isolation feels really bad and can escalate the threat-stress response, can jack up the cytokines. We can move from being afraid and worried into frank panic, and that can drive us into freeze and faint and collapse and potentially death. So we need to look at how in that environment we can continue to keep people engaged and connected. And I think it can be done. I think if they're not too sick yet and they don't require ICU care and they're not on a ventilator, that we should be having them engaging in their breathing exercises. We should engage them in doing their sensory emotional integration work. If they are, we can train them in meditation, but we need to be providing them with some ways of expressing their emotions. They're probably sick enough that they're not wanting to move a lot, but they can be drawing, they can be watercoloring, they can do expressive writing to help soothe themselves. And then the other piece of this is the mechanisms by which we, although we've done physical distancing, the mechanisms by which we can maintain emotional, social, and spiritual connection by really tapping into our technologies. And I do think you're in that environment where you cannot see anybody's face, and we engage in facial expressions and vocal expressions and posture. Our body senses all those things naturally, and in the hospital we can't see faces, and in general people are very serious, very repressed, and very stressed. But if we can get family members and friends and pastors, if we can get them engaging these people on their devices, we may be able to help them heal prior to having them undergo a huge decompensation from fight and flight into freeze and faint. So that's what I wanted to lay out there today. Another way of looking at this, going way upstream to fight for ourselves and our communities, our docs and our scientists will continue to focus on some downstream measures that they can do to help people survive. We have to be very careful with those if they're mistimed or inappropriate. They could lead to a quicker demise for somebody. But there's a lot that we can be doing around this to help people. And it does bring us to, the leadership that the United States of America has had in its past, and particularly the quote of Franklin Delano Roosevelt when he said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. So that is absolutely true in this crisis as well, and maybe even more so, because the fear response escalating to anxiety, chronic worry, and panic is associated with an elevating threat stress response with elevating cytokines, and that is eventually pushing us from our fight and flight response into freeze and faint physiology, where we can undergo this dramatic collapse and death, but even without death, sometimes significant injury to our bodies as well. So it seems inappropriate at times in this state of crisis. There's a seriousness about it, and that is appropriate. But for us not to fight back with every tool we have, including doing things that make us distinctly human and not only decompress the threat stress response, but boost our immunity, would also be absolutely wrong to do. So we need to grab all of these tools, and we need to be able to still experience pleasure and joy and love and music and dance and expression and play, or we're not going to survive. Thank you.